Good morning. Thanks for coming out on this lovely day for what is a very important event. The weather is not cooperating as much as we'd like, but we really appreciate all of you being here. I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. And we're delighted to host this discussion of Tom Christensen's latest book. Before we turn things over to Tom and to the commentators, I just want to give a couple minutes of context. American policy towards China has been debated for as long as there's been the U.S. and China around, which is a few hundred years. And the range of options that have been discussed, since at least the Cold War are quite broad, from those who have suggested U.S. accommodation toward China, to those who suggest some sort of reciprocity or conditional type of cooperation or hedging. Others have focused on pressure. Even some have said rollback as far. And then we've also heard proposals from others that suggest the U.S. should shift the burden toward managing the relationship with China toward others closer to China. And certainly some, not many these days, say, we might even consider not focusing so much on China at all, that there might be other higher priorities in the world. I think that's less and less likely to be heard, but nevertheless is one of the things that people have mentioned. Now, despite the fact that there has always been a very wide spectrum of debate about American policy towards China, China policy has been relatively consistent over at least the last 40-some-odd years. What has changed has been American policy towards other parts of the world, which casts U.S. policy towards China in a different light. But nevertheless, the American policy has been relatively consistent. I think there's been differences in implementation for the most part. But there's a lot of pressure now for change. From the Chinese perspective, that change comes from Xi Jinping, who proposes that the U.S. and China establish a new form of great power relations, which is essentially consistent with the first policy proposal that I mentioned, a greater American accommodation of China. Within the United States, there's growing discussions about policy in the opposite direction, towards shifting towards some type of reciprocity or conditional cooperation, towards greater pressure and contestation with China. Tom's book, The China Challenge, is one of the most important contributions to this discussion that we have this year. You can always say that U.S.-China relations are at a turning point, but maybe this year and this season we really are. Particularly if you watch the debates both on the Democratic and Republican side. And so in a minute, we're going to invite Tom to introduce his book and lay out his ideas and thoughts. In addition to that, though, I invited Dan and Michael to be here today because I wanted there to be a conversation about Tom's ideas and the relationship. About 12 years ago, I edited a book about the debate on U.S.-China relations called China Crosstalk, which was a collection of different points of view. And one of the things I noticed is that the different commentators with different views often speak past each other. They sometimes start with different assumptions, they have different points of departure, and therefore they arrive at different conclusions, but oftentimes they aren't put in a position of directly speaking with each other and unlocking those differences and actually sometimes finding the places of unexpected overlap and agreement. And so I take the responsibility, and CSIS does, of highlighting those areas of unexpected consensus and areas of difference quite seriously. And Tom has been gracious enough to let us try to do that as well today, which I think is part of our role in pushing forward the conversation on this topic. Tom is the William P. Boswell Professor of World Politics and Peace and War and Director of the China and the World Program at Princeton. From 2006 to 2008, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, with responsibility for relations with China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. Before teaching at Princeton, he taught at Cornell and MIT. His PhD is from Columbia University, and this is just the latest of many contributions he's made to the field. Almost 20 years ago, he published Useful Adversaries, which was about U.S. China relations in the late 1940s to the beginning of the Great Leap. And just 4 years ago, he published Worse Than a Monolith, which is about alliance politics in the region. So he's someone that has an amazing amount of academic experience and also public policy experience as well, which forms the foundation for the contribution that he's made this year, and he's going to share with us today. So please join me in welcoming Tom Christensen.
Thanks very much to Scott Kennedy, and also to Chris Johnson, who's sort of the sponsor of all of this. And it's great to be here at CSIS. I'm really honored that Dan Blumenthal and Michael Swaine took the time out of their busy schedules to come and talk about my work. And thanks to all of you for being here. It's not a very pleasant day, and you all came out, and I'm really honored that you're here. And I see a couple of my colleagues from the State Department here. I dedicated the book to my colleagues from the State Department, and I'm really honored that you would come back and see me after you had to work with me. My new book deals with two major challenges that I see are attendant to China's rise. Those challenges are for the United States, allies in Asia, and the United States security partners in particular around the world. And the first challenge is how to dissuade China from destabilizing East Asia, which is a region that's very important to the United States and obviously very important to America's Asian allies and security partners, and how to dissuade China from handling its very many sovereignty disputes with its neighbors through coercion and the use of force in a way that would destabilize the region. And before I go into the reasons why I'm concerned about that, I just say, if it seems like I'm picking on China as being very aggressive or sort of culturally inclined to destabilize its region as its power grows, I'm not. I wrote an article in 2000 with Richard Betts in which we said, if China handles its rise in its region as badly as the United States handled its rise in its region in the late 19th century, we're in for really big trouble because the largely unnecessary Spanish-American War that was followed by a big counterinsurgency war in the Philippines. So if China goes down that route, we're in big trouble. I raised this challenge of China destabilizing its region because I think there's been too much writing in the United States media and also in academic circles about alternative concerns about China's rise. One of those is that China is trying to drive us entirely out of the region, the Americans entirely out of the region. I just don't see any persistent evidence that that is Chinese strategy, both in behavior and in strategic writings, that China is trying to drive the United States out of the region. If it were to happen, it would be extremely conflict-ridden and extremely destabilizing, but I don't see evidence of that yet. The other one is a more expansive Chinese goal, the idea that China is trying to replace the United States as a leading superpower around the world. I don't see the intention for that. I also don't see the capabilities for that for decades to come. So I don't really worry about that scenario. But China is already powerful enough to destabilize East Asia, and that capability is only going to grow year in and year out. We're going to have more and more capabilities for China to destabilize a region that matters a lot to us. And I say in the book, and I don't want to go into detail here because in the interest of time, why China is unlikely to become a global superpower rival of the United States anytime soon. It's not a peer competitor of the United States, but that's where the good news ends. China doesn't need to be a peer competitor of the United States to pose real security challenges. And as China's military modernizes and its economic wherewithal grows, it can cause some real problems for the United States and its allies and security partners that we have to take seriously. China has many points of friction. I only have one other slide. Well, let's see if I can do this. Apparently I can't.
It's the down button.
Oh, the button on the screen. He said that too. You know, I got one instruction. I'm still a professor. So that's not going to work. All right.
The Chinese sphere of influence.
This is working. Excellent. So we see the sovereignty disputes. This is the 9-dash line, drawn as carefully as I did. So China claims all that. This isn't very subtle, this machine. So we have the Philippines, claims out to about here. It's a rectangle. Excuse that little, Philippines didn't expand. Vietnam comes out here, Malaysia up here. So you have disputes in the South China Sea over reefs and islands and surrounding waters. You have a dispute with Taiwan. I've lost the cursor. You can see Taiwan. I only taught at MIT. I didn't actually learn anything there. So the dispute of Taiwan is different. It's about the sovereign status of the government in Taipei. It's not about the territorial issue per se. And then there's a dispute above Taiwan, just north of Taiwan, between China and Japan over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, depending on which country version you're talking about. And the problem with these disputes is that China now has the capability to project power offshore for the first time. And you have a situation in which China, for a very long time, had a traditional land army that had two missions. And it's important to understand those two missions. One was to oppose the domestic enemies of the Chinese Communist Party, and the other was to oppose the foreign enemies of the Chinese Communist Party. So when you think about Chinese security, PRC security, think about Chinese Communist Party security. And that land army could not project power offshore, and it was not a big threat to its neighbors. And it was accompanied by a relatively rudimentary nuclear deterrent in the form of liquid-fueled missiles. And according to public reports, those missiles were not mated with the warheads, so they were relatively slow in responding, and they were relatively limited in number. So that was the traditional PRC military. In the last 20 years, this has changed rather radically, where China has the ability to get offshore and raise costs to superior military potential foes or actual foes in a conflict in ways it never could before. And that impacts these very large-scale sovereignty disputes that I mentioned before. Their asymmetric capabilities, and in the Chinese strategic writings, it's recognized that the foes against which these would be used are likely to be superior military forces. Right? This is not domination. This is not driving the United States out of the region, but it's a real challenge to those forward deployed forces. And those asymmetric capabilities include accurate conventionally tipped ballistic missiles, road mobile, solid fueled, including, according to public reports in recent times, the ability to strike moving targets at sea with an anti-ship ballistic missile that has terminal guidance after re-entry into the atmosphere. And that's a real challenge to superior forward deployed U.S. forces, in particular aircraft carriers. Submarines. Relatively quiet diesel-electric submarines that can do a few sophisticated missions, like lay sophisticated sea mines, shoot sophisticated torpedoes, and fire cruise missiles from below the surface of the sea, putting at risk, again, forward deployed forces. Cruise missiles that can be fired off of fast boats, advanced aircraft, and air defenses. And air defenses don't get enough attention because the air defenses that China has reverse engineered from the Russians project an air defense umbrella off the coast that, again, puts at risk superior U.S. and allied air forces in a potential conflict. Anti-satellite weapons, cyber, you've heard about those, which reduce America's, the cyber could slow down American logistics capabilities in a conflict to get into the region. And the ASATs could reduce America's superiority in what's called C4ISR, the ability to see and direct forces in a distant theater. Finally, there's nuclear modernization, and I'll return to why I mentioned this in a moment. China's deterrent is no longer a rudimentary deterrent. It now has solid-fueled, road-mobile, nuclear-tipped missiles, and in addition, it is now, according to public reports, deploying a nuclear deterrent at sea in the submarines. So this isn't domination. This isn't ruling the world. But this is a real challenge for the United States and its allies in East Asia, and we have to take it extremely seriously. It's not a new Cold War. The Cold War was terrible. The Cold War was really dangerous, and I'm not celebrating the Cold War and looking back nostalgically on it. I'm glad the United States and the other anti-Soviet partners fought the Cold War and won it. It was a great thing for human history. But there's one thing that I will say that will make it sound like I'm nostalgic, and I'm not. And that is that from 1962 to the end of the Cold War, in many ways the Cold War was less complicated from a diplomatic point of view than what we're facing in East Asia today. East Asia is more complicated, in many ways harder to manage with the military and the diplomatic components that are necessary to manage it. Why is that? Because in the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the exception of West Berlin, there was a kind of recognition about where the lines were between the two camps. You kind of understood what aggression would look like. If NATO drove into Eastern Europe, that would be aggression. If the Warsaw Pact drove into Western Europe, that would be aggression. Why is that important? We know from human psychology studies, the Nobel Prize-winning work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, my colleague at Princeton, that people in general, across cultures, across genders, will take bigger risks and pay bigger costs to defend what they believe is legitimately theirs, the legitimate status quo, than they will to achieve new things. That's an enormously stabilizing force, psychological force, in a world particularly with nuclear weapons. The problem in East Asia is that nobody agrees on what the legitimate status quo is. And everybody, and this is what really concerns me, I've talked to diplomats from all the disputing countries, they all believe, in my opinion, sincerely believe that their claims are legitimate. I almost wish they were lying. I wish they were aggressors who were lying. But I believe they really believe this stuff is theirs. Why is that important? You go back to Tversky and Kahneman. They're all more likely to take risks and pay high costs to defend what they believe is really theirs. And these things there's no consensus about that. There's an overlap. That's particularly dangerous. A second problem is the United States has grown in a tradition of protecting its forward deployed forces against cost-raising conventional tactics by real or potential adversaries, by maintaining the ability to cripple those adversarial assets early in a crisis, taking out the command and control for those assets of a potential enemy, taking out the actual weapon systems themselves. And the problem with China is that the U.S., with forward deployed forces in East Asia that are at risk, if an American president wanted to do that, it would be launching the president might be tempted to launch robust attacks against the assets at home of a nuclear power. And that's just never happened before. We've never launched a large-scale conventional attack on the homeland of a nuclear power in order to protect forward deployed U.S. forces. And what makes it more complicated, and why I gave you all that detail with all those hyphenated adjectives about missiles before, is that China has done something that the Soviets didn't, which is built its conventional forces that are going to challenge U.S. Forces and its nuclear deterrent on the same basic spines, on the Second Artillery's missile force and on submarines. So a prosecution of those systems by a forward deployed U.S. force could easily be misread by a Chinese leadership as attacks not just on the conventional forces, but also on the ability for China to have a second strike deterrent, if it was a robust and effective attack. So that poses a challenge that we didn't face before, and that's an escalation challenge. Now, that's the security piece, and that's the piece that I think the U.S. can handle quite well. Why? Because I think the U.S. government is structured to handle security challenges like this, coercive diplomatic challenges. Despite all the talk about lack of interagency coordination, the Pentagon and the State Department actually do coordinate, and they have a National Security Council structure to deal with these things. The second challenge I'm about to describe, the U.S. government is not well structured to deal with, and neither are the governments of our allies and friends, and that's the global governance challenge. And the global governance challenge is the tougher challenge because we have no experience in trying to convince a uniquely powerful developing country to contribute to solving problems around the world that pose real risks to all of the great powers in the world and the rest of the countries in the world if they're not handled well. So in a nutshell, China is a great power. It's not a peer competitor of the United States. It is also a developing country with a lot of domestic problems and a rather large post-colonial nationalist chip on its shoulder. And we're in a world that's so globalized and integrated that we require every great power to contribute actively to solving various global governance problems around the world, including non-proliferation issues, maintenance of financial stability, maintenance of regional stability in various regions of the world, and preventing humanitarian disasters, and finally, environmental issues like climate change. If all the great powers don't contribute to the solution of those problems, then it's going to be very difficult to solve those problems. If one of them obstructs, it's even worse. But even if one of them, especially a country the size of China, does not contribute actively to the solution, it's going to be very difficult if it just free rides on the efforts of others. We've never asked a developing country in the past to contribute to solving problems in far-flung places for the purpose of global stability. And China's economy is so big, and its environmental footprint is so big, that if you don't have China on board, it's very difficult to pressure various governments around the world to change their behavior in a constructive way. And I think about non-proliferation. China's economy is plenty large already, even though it's a developing country, to provide sustenance to targeted regimes on non-proliferation, regimes that are targeted by economic sanctions from other countries. So China is by far the biggest economic partner of North Korea. The North Korean regime will be just fine as long as China maintains normal economic relations with North Korea. And the same is true for Iran, and a lot of people don't know that China is by far the biggest economic partner of Iran, both in terms of purchases and in terms of sales of commodities, of manufactured goods. And when you think about things like snapback in the current agreement, if China doesn't snap back with everybody else, it's going to be very difficult to pressure Iran. And it's not clear that China will be as willing as the other countries to snap back, because it doesn't see a lot of the pre-existing sanctions that were on Iran as legitimate, because they were unilateral American and European sanctions. So that's a real problem. And then there's issues like greenhouse gases, where there are good arguments on both sides. On the side outside of China, you say China is producing twice as many greenhouse gases already as the United States, and the gap is growing. And the United States has not shrouded itself in glory on this issue, so being twice as polluting as the United States is a big deal. But then the Chinese come back and say, on a per capita basis, if we consumed energy and emitted greenhouse gases like you, we'd all be underwater. Right? And you developed first, and you polluted for many, many years. So if you go historically on a per capita basis, the United States is number 2. UK is holding on to its position as the number 1 per capita historical polluter, but the United States is closing. China is way down the list. Right? And it's a cumulative problem. And basically, if you look at China as an economy, it's enormous. But if you look at China as a per capita economy, and you say, 2012 was the last year I could get good statistics, China's economy was, on a per capita basis in 2012, by the most expansive definition of China's GNP, the size of Ecuador's, $9,000 a year. Nobody's asking Ecuadorians to solve far-flung problems around the world. No one's saying to Ecuador, if you don't line up with us on Iran, we're in big trouble. Right? Why? Because there's 1.3 billion Chinese. So you have a very large economy, but they also have this idea, you had relations with crappy regimes over energy, and now we do. It's our turn. And a lot of the markets have been locked up. So we're moving into the places we can, like Sudan and Iran. Would we like to be in more stable places without humanitarian disaster? Sure. So there are arguments on the Chinese side that you can't just dismiss out of hand. And that poses the big diplomatic challenge for the United States. How do you convince this country to pull in a positive direction? And if it doesn't, everybody suffers, including China. If you look at financial stability issues, my favorite example is the Greek crisis of 2012. I return to that idea, $9,000 a year, by the most expansive, the World Bank PPP measures, $9,000 a year. So it wasn't so much Americans, it was Europeans and Australians asking China to contribute to solve the Greek crisis in 2012. So Chinese people are looking at Greece and they say, well, what's their per capita GNP? in 2012. It was about $24,000 a year. And why are they in trouble? Well, because they have profligate government spending. They've got social safety net like we couldn't imagine in China, right, from a Chinese perspective. They've got 14-month pensions for people who retire at 55. Everybody works for the government. Everyone's got health insurance. And the Chinese have none of that. That's the dirty secret. Chinese Communist Party, well, they're communists, but they don't have a lot of social safety net for their citizens. And they're just developing it, right? And they're just developing these systems now. And it's expensive, and it's not a clean process. And you're asking them, from a Chinese perspective, to bail out these fat Europeans? On the other side of the argument, there's a very logical argument, which is the EU is China's biggest trading partner as a corporate whole, or has been, most years in the last 10 years. And if Greece brings down the EU, it's going to hurt China terribly. China has a stake in the international economy. So it would make some sense to bail them out. So what happens? Who wins that debate? The first argument wins the debate. Wen Jiabao goes to Europe. He meets with the German chancellor. And you have a Chinese communist in Europe. And what is he calling for? Fiscal austerity. Right? The communists are in Europe calling for fiscal austerity. You guys have to tighten your belts. So this is a basic problem. And obviously, for greenhouse gases, it's an enormous problem for financial stability, for non-proliferation, for regional concerns. And on regional concerns, we have a big issue with the American bipartisan fetish with regime change. And that really alienates the Chinese early on in crises. It keeps them from pressuring the regimes that are targeted. And I don't want to go into great detail about my prescriptions. I'm going to end soon. But one of the things I draw out of the history when I study the history of U.S. foreign policy towards China from George H.W. Bush, the end of the Cold War, to the present, is that it has been counterproductive to open all of these crises with foreign countries with calling for the ouster of a regime in question. And basically, my position is sometimes we really want those regimes to go, but if you really want them to go, shut up about it. Focus on proscribed behavior, get the maximum pressure on the regime that you can by keeping the Chinese and the Russians at least nominally on board, and maybe get the Chinese to pressure, which that economy is huge, then maybe you actually will get that result. But if you open your negotiations with this regime or that regime has to go, you're unlikely to get anywhere with the Chinese. And if you don't get anywhere with the Chinese economy is plenty large to provide sustenance. The Russians are plenty well armed to provide arms, and you end up with the worst possible outcome, which is no international coordination on the issue. The regime stays in power and the problem persists. I drew other lessons. I have basically 5 big lessons that I drew from studying the history of how the administration since George H.W. Bush through the Obama administration have tackled these twin problems that I outlined. I don't have time to go into them today because I want to hear what other people have to say about my book. But if you want to talk about policy lessons in the Q&A, I'd be happy to do that. I've spoken for too long. I will thank Scott again, and thank you all again for being here. And whether you agree with the book or not, I hope it's clear. I hope the book is clear, right? So that you understand what I'm arguing. That's my main goal, and then we can have a discussion on that basis. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Tom. I think we will get to a question on your policy prescriptions. But before we do that, let's turn to Michael and Dan. We're going to do this in alphabetical order. We'll start with Dan. Dan's the Director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security issues and Sino-American relations. From 2001 to 2004, he served as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the Department of Defense. He also, from 2006 to 2012, served as a commissioner on the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. He just recently, a few weeks ago, published a very interesting article, China's Discomfort in an American World, which is, I think, part of the foundation for a monograph he's working on, which is also going to contributing to this conversation. Dan, we're delighted you're here. Could come across the street, around the corner from AEI, and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, and I'm glad I can see what a new building looks like because
It's beautiful.
we are. It's a beautiful new building because that's the think tank way now. We're getting one ourselves in the next few months. Tom's book is excellent, And I just have to say, in general, Tom is kind of exactly what I think you want in American foreign policy, which is very independent-minded scholar who served in government as a diplomat, as well as continues to provide his advice to the government. So very pleased to be on this panel with Tom and with Michael. And thank you, Scott. And Tom was also, it's there in Washington, D.C., there's no prize for being right, and there's no penalty for being wrong. So in some ways, it's a great gig. But Tom was right, in his articles in the 90s, opposing problems without catching up, which I think in many ways he's still arguing in this book. And posing problems without catching up sort of framed the issue right. And when we were at the Pentagon early on, it was, if you can believe it or not, it was a lonely place to be somewhat more hawkish. It really was. I mean, the argumentation on the outside was still about China's million-man swim, can't take Taiwan, and just issues of China will never do this and never do that. And I think to some extent we're all hawks now. We're all hawks, but Tom sort of framed it right early on, and that was very helpful to me personally, and I think also to us at DoD. We're all hawks, and increasingly we're all bears on Chinese economy as well. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I am a lawyer, and so that taught me how to make assaults on all kinds of fields without licenses to do so. And one of the things I thought was very compelling in Tom's work on this book was this matrix and framework he gave us to think about Chinese behavior in terms of how weak it was internally compared to how strong it was internationally or in a power position, and how weak the United States seemed to China versus how strong its rhetoric was, which was a really fascinating way to think about it. I certainly I've never even set foot close to MIT, so I can't do the matrix. But it seems to me that one of Tom's key arguments was that when he looked at the case of the Taiwan Straits crisis in '95, in terms of this matrix, the argument seemed to be that the Bill Clinton administration came in with very strong rhetoric on human rights issues with respect to China and on some other issues, and a strong support of Taiwan. But China perceived, according to Tom's argument, that the United States was actually acting weak because it backed down on some of these issues. And this is very important for all of us Asia hands, I think. It also perceived the United States as weak internationally because we pulled out of Somalia in the way we did, or at least China perceived that. But we were talking very strongly. But we got a good outcome because the Bill Clinton administration reversed itself, as Tom points out, and upgraded its guidelines with Japan, sent a clear message of deterrence on the Taiwan issue, while it was reassuring China on some other issues, and China, in fact, engaged in some of its most constructive diplomacy at that time, which is a very good lesson for policy, 95, 96. They viewed the United States as strong, but not overly threatening. I don't think there's any way for the United States to not seem threatening to China. As Andy Nathan said to me recently, the basic security problem for China is the perception and the reality that they're surrounded by the United States and its allies, and it's just an untenable situation for any great power, including, as Tom pointed out, the United States, as it was growing into a great power. So I think there's no way really to fully reassure China, but at least I think, as Tom argues, that was a good outcome because we seem stronger and more committed without being overly provocative. And to continue with that matrix or that framework, I think the argument in the George W. Bush years was that the United States seemed too strong and too provocative, and that wasn't a great outcome either. And when the United States, and Tom was part of this, backed off a little bit on its rhetoric and its particularly on North Korea, we got a better outcome from China in terms of its diplomacy. And then that brings us to now, which is probably what most people who come to think tanks really want to talk about, and Tom's analysis of China's perception, once again, that we were weak after the financial crisis and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that the Obama people didn't at first have all that much experience in foreign policy and made some key mistakes with respect to China that Tom lays out in terms of conceptually on the issues of strategic reassurance and some of the other issues when they turned around, as all administrations do, and take a tougher line on certain issues, whether it's human rights with respect to the Dalai Lama, Taiwan security, or other issues. China was in really high dudgeon about that reversal, perceived us as a little bit weaker. But what's interesting here, perceived us a little bit weaker, but provocative also because of some of the ways in which Tom lays out the rhetorical flourishes of the "we are back in Asia" rhetoric and the pivot and so on. And so, in some ways, we got the worst outcome. Or not the worst outcome, obviously, because things are pretty stable, but not a great outcome in terms of looking weak in China's eyes, but being very rhetorically provocative. But the other, I think, very interesting point here is Tom's analysis that it was partly China's own domestic insecurity in 2008, 2009, 2010, combined with just more power and prestige in the world that was in part a driver between part of its more, we look for the right terms, assertive, abrasive, aggressive, whatever type of behavior that we all are now reading about and becoming somewhat accustomed to in the South China Sea and in Japan, on the Senkaku Daitai issue and so on. And so domestic insecurity plus strength, plus more strength, has led to not great outcomes in terms of stability in the Asia Pacific. So that's a very fascinating way to look at things. Of course, it begs the question of what is China perceive about itself in terms of strength, weakness, and the United States going forward. And I think that brings me back to this issue of, I find the cases on the bearish side on China's economy very compelling. That China is really entering into a perhaps 10 to 15 year period of what might be a lost decade, what might be Japan-like stagnation, not collapse, but stagnation, very low growth numbers. And it's compelling to me in the sense that the model, the middle income trap, the model isn't working any longer. For the Chinese model to work, you need very huge export markets in the United States and in the EU. Those no longer exist. The amount of debt China's collected because of the stimulus package they had in 2009. And it's really, if you look at various numbers, it makes us look like we're fiscally responsible, which is very hard to do, and just overinvestment, and then, of course, the labor force shrinkage and demography problems and so on. So what does this mean from a power political perspective, which is that one thing I think that all of us who do Asia work need to think about is what is the correct way to approach China in stagnation or in lower growth? Because that's not the China that we've been dealing with for the last 30 or so years, not at all. And so that's, I think, a key question. I think what I got from Tom's analysis is that a weaker, more insecure China that still has a great amount of resources internationally, has more prestige and has more military capability, does not bode well for stability in the Asia Pacific. And of course, there are other factors, and that is, political and who is Xi Jinping and what exactly is he trying to do and so on. We certainly have examples galore. Certainly, Vladimir Putin provides one example for us of a country that is clearly in secular decline in so many ways, but is not going down easy and is actually asserting itself very strongly throughout the world. And of course, comparisons are always tenuous, but that's just something to think about to the extent this Chinese weakness continues, or this Chinese internal weakness continues. So I think using the framework and metric that Tom put out for us could be very useful as we think about, as he says, shaping China's choices. So that's sort of one set of issues that I wanted to cover. But I think Tom covered very well. I will say that that and let me sort of end with 2 points. One is on the point about what is China's strategy and what is our strategy. I agree with Tom. China doesn't, to my mind, or anything that I've seen, have a strategy of pushing the United States out of Asia. But I don't think my read of history, including the United States sort of great ambition and explosion onto the world stage at the end of the 19th century, I don't think the U.S. had a strategy either to become a great power or to dominate the globe. I think that's not usually how things work. I think China may have a strategy just to engage in this coercive diplomacy, or not a strategy, but a tool to gain more power and prominence and at least to develop for itself more security in its own mind around its periphery. But a series of events could occur such that the United States could then be in a very disadvantageous position. For example, if the region or China perceives that the United States was not necessarily responding correctly to any number of issues, from Taiwan to the Philippines, I think both a cascade of events, of unplanned events, I think could happen where even if China didn't want to be the regional hegemon, it may be just because the United States slowly and gradually loses its position in the Asia Pacific. I think that's what happened to the British Empire in the Middle East. In any place historically where a country has been dominant and lost its dominant position, it was one or two catalyzing events plus possibly a structural issue. So I agree basically on what Tom's saying about China's plans, but again, I think China has to be careful what it wishes for if it does succeed in any one of these issues, because let's just take the issue of Taiwan. If China does succeed somehow in coercing unification, that could have a huge negative feedback loop for the United States' position with respect to Japan and some of the other allies, and China could all of a sudden find itself in a position of dominance, and the U.S. could find itself in an untenable position. Could. But these are all future scenarios. We don't have the data. Finally, in terms of U.S. shaping policies, the U.S. is, as Tom argues very well, far stronger than China. I mean, it's not even close. Even if you take some of the data that the Fed puts out and Credit Suisse puts out on net national private wealth, which in some ways is a better metric than GDP per capita or GNP of a nation's ability to extract resources over a long period of time for political reasons, it's not even close. I mean, it's like a $45 trillion gap or something like that, and growing. But there's this question of what we want to do in the world, and I think we have this sort of happy bipartisan consensus now in the United States that we want to do more with less, that we want to keep our defense budget, extraordinarily low. If you look at the numbers, the United States is very powerful, but we're down to 260 ships in the Navy and probably going down. I mean, we're doing our bipartisan best to decimate our Navy, and I don't see any plans in the offing to reverse that. We have a bipartisan consensus not to do anything about our entitlement programs and debt, and that's getting into the $18 trillion in debt and obviously unfunded liabilities of even more. So we are more powerful, but we have this decision in the United States about whether we actually want to keep playing the role of hegemon or prime player or however you want to call it in the region. And so far, I think our answer has been, let's keep doing more with less and see how that works out for us with less resources and not tackle our big problems. So, I guess I would end on this shaping question. So one is, and Tom tantalizes us with this question of what is U.S. national interests in the Asia Pacific. And he writes, is it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, question mark. It's a fascinating question. And it goes to Tom's point in the sense that I agree with him completely that unlike Europe, even Cold War, not Cold War, we have not developed a very good sense for ourselves about what we really think would be an optimal Asia, both in terms of very clear and concrete issues of sovereignty and territory, structures of political and diplomatic engagement, it's nowhere near, and sort of updated alliance structures, it's nowhere near the kinds of things we thought about after World War II for Europe, not even close, in terms of those institutions. There's a lot of institutions in Asia, but I don't think the strategically minded people in the United States have really thought through what structures, or even new structures, what might work for us, and that goes to this question of what is our national security interest. And you even see it playing out a little bit on these debates about freedom of navigation operations most recently. Are we only and solely interested in freedom of navigation, or do we actually have an interest in how the territories are disposed of at the end of the day? And I think that's a big question that we have to think through. So I guess I'll end on that, not just that particular question, but what is our enduring interest in the Asia Pacific? And I think if you can't come to China with that, and China comes to you with what its enduring interests are, you're not having the same conversation in terms of the highest levels of diplomacy. You're having a very different set of conversations. So finally, I think this, as I said before, the shaping question, the shaping China's choices is going to be very different. If under conditions of, let's say, a 10, 15-year Chinese stagnation period. I'll end there. The book covers a lot. It's very rich. I could go on forever, and I appreciate the chance to just share some thoughts on it.
Dan, thanks very much. In some ways, I'm reassured by what you said, even though you weren't necessarily intending. China may back into hegemonic status, even though it wasn't intending. And the U.S. could steal defeat from the jaws of victory if we decide not to keep our military going the way we ought to, which is maybe the problem's more in here than in Asia, perhaps. Let's turn now to Michael Swaine. Michael's a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was formerly a senior policy analyst at the Rand Corporation. He's a specialist on Chinese defense, foreign policy, U.S. China relations, and East Asian international relations. He's authored and edited more than a dozen books and monographs, and far many more journal articles and book chapters in these areas, and directs multiple projects at the Carnegie Endowment. He received his doctorate in government from a small school in near Boston, Harvard University. One of the most interesting things he's written recently on this topic that we're discussing today is called Beyond U.S. Predominance in the Western Pacific, the Need for a Stable U.S.-China Balance of Power, which came out in April. I don't know if you're going to talk partly on that, but an excellent contribution to the conversation, and look forward to your remarks today.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was very happy to be invited by Scott to comment on Tom's book. I've admired Tom for a long time, and I respect his views on China very, very much. You haven't seen many sparks so far. I don't think you're going to see many more from me. I think this is a really good book. I think it's very comprehensive. It's very insightful in a lot of ways. It's a good overview of the U.S.-China relationship and of Chinese foreign policy since the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. It's about that. I think it's broad enough in scope, and it's sufficiently general in its treatment to be really useful in the university, particularly in graduate studies. But it also presents, as Dan mentioned, a framework for assessing and managing U.S.-China policy that I think even specialists will find very valuable. So what I'm going to do, and I hope not a whole lot of time here because we're going to have it for Q&A, I want to comment a little bit about Tom's approach to this issue of U.S.-China relations, the analytical structure of the book, and his main arguments that are of interest to me and my view, and then touch on some of both what are the strengths and, in my view, some of the shortcomings of the book from my perspective. Now, in terms of the approach and the arguments, Tom covers basically the same ground, but with quite a different approach in some ways from the one I adopted in the book I wrote in 2011 called America's Challenge, both recognizing that there's a challenge here, and it's a very significant one. In my book, I focus mainly on the functional aspects of U.S. policy toward China in the main areas. The evolution of U.S. policy over time in these areas, and then their apparent success and failure. Now, Tom does somewhat the same thing in various parts of the book, but he also treats a lot of these functional issues in some ways in more conceptual terms about different aspects of U.S.-China relations and how the Chinese look at these issues. And he does focus more on the Chinese side, in my view, than he does on the U.S. side in looking at this relationship. There are two basic sections if you've looked at the book, and I certainly hope you have. One of them is one that looks at the relevant features of China's rise and the U.S., for the U.S. and its behavior of what is of concern or relevance to the United States. That's basically the first half of the book, or more than first half. And then the second, he looks historically, taking a lot of these issues and playing them out through three periods that he looks at in the post-Cold War era. In all of this, I mean, he makes some very strong arguments that I think many people accept. First, that China's rise is very real. We're not, despite the limitations that we've been talking about, it's real, it's significant in economic, in military, in diplomatic terms. And you can see it in all various ways. Tom does a great job of describing all of that. I totally agree with the analysis he presents. He also argues, however, that China is rising in a very different context from the 19th century, a great power rivalry at that time, or even the mid-20th century Cold War era. It's a very different era in many ways, more integrated, more channeled into productive activities on the part of all countries, less existentially competitive, and more restrained, in part because of nuclear weapons. I agree with that almost entirely as well. Thirdly, he says that the major strategic and conventional security threat is not global. And it's based on China. It's not global, and it's not based on China surpassing the U.S. as a global superpower, as we've heard. It's more limited in scope, it's regionally focused, it's asymmetrical, and it results from both what China can do and from what it does not do but should do. I largely agree with most of that as well. I certainly agree that from a strategic perspective, in the security sense, the issue is Asia. It's not global. The issue is the differences between the United States and its allies in China about the Asian environment. And the next point that Tom makes is that the greatest challenge, even though he emphasizes the security dimensions of it, he feels that the greatest challenge is really global. It's about governance. It's about non-proliferation, climate, global economy, peacekeeping, humanitarian issues, etc. And so here, and he feels, as he said, China's been too often failed to act or acted only to serve its own interests and for domestic reasons, which, of course, most countries do. And it needs to take greater responsibility. Now, I disagree. Tom may actually not disagree with this, but it sounded like he did in the book. I don't agree that the main challenge for the United States is global with China. I think that the global issues we confront with the Chinese are, by and large, pretty manageable for a variety of reasons. I think the main challenge is in Asia, as I said a minute ago. Now, Tom, and I'll speak a little bit more about this in a second. And Tom says that the history of U.S. policy since the end of the Cold War has had a lot of successes and failures. I totally agree with that, but mainly successes. The challenge is to balance deterrence with reassurance effectively in shaping China's policies in the world. Now, the interesting thing, and I will go into the policy areas of Tom's book because I think they are, for me at least, as a policy analyst, they're the most important. They're the most significant. And he offers several general guidelines in observing the history of U.S.-China relations in the post-Cold War era. First of all, be strong but moderate. Great. Wield a big stick, but use mainly soft words. Show empathy. A willingness to listen to Chinese views, but don't signal weakness. That's kind of tough. Understand the importance of the domestic context for Beijing's approach to policies. Appeal to its domestic needs, for example, for building new structures and incentives within China as part of the reform process. But also recognize that domestic politics and social pressures can drive Chinese reactions in very negative directions. Avoid policies that accentuate Beijing's worst fears, i.e. regime change. A statement that he made, and in the context of Libya, Syria, and North Korea, extremely important to understand. Couch reassurance efforts in terms of specific policy problems and concerns, not general principles, such as respect for core interests. I'll come back to this in a second. Maximize cooperation where feasible on global issues, where positive sum outcomes are possible, I think increasingly possible, and common interests are prevalent. In this effort, garners support of local elites. I mean, Tom goes into some length to talk about how U.S. policy failed or succeeded based in part on its ability or inability to generate consensus or support or play into existing support on the part of local states, African Union, et cetera, who had strong support for positions that the U.S. was taking. Without that sort of larger contextual framework, your ability to convince the Chinese to do things that they don't believe are necessarily in the interests of developing countries in themselves is not going to be too good. And I think that's a very important thing. At the same time, though, take opportunities if they arise to show Beijing the costs of its quote-unquote bad behavior and its bullying through strengthened alliances, capacity building among other states, but avoid immoderate rhetoric. Now, I think all of these, last point, be attentive to both the dangers and the utility of coercive diplomacy. The dangers and the utility of coercive diplomacy. Again, striking that balance. Now, I think all of these are, for the most part, very correct assessments about U.S. policy toward China. I also think they're very strongly agreed upon among most U.S. policymakers. I think most U.S. policymakers understand this, even though they don't often practice it. And they don't often practice it in part because of domestic issues in U.S. policy, because of certain other larger issues in the global context, because of certain assumptions that are also held that are contradictory to these beliefs. I mean, Americans themselves are not the only countries prone to contradictory thinking and actions and behavior. In any event, as I say, I think the strengths are many in this book, very comprehensive and insightful. And he does capture some of the contradictory elements on the Chinese side. And he provides some very on-mark assessments about Chinese views towards North Korea, Iran, the global economy. Okay, now get to the shortcomings, which aren't many. But they're kind of significant, and they're differences that Tom and I have had for a long time on some issues. The first is, one is conceptual, one is historical, one is structural, from my position. They're kind of related. And obviously, this is just my own view. I mean, other people, I'm sure, disagree on this. Conceptually, I think a lot of Tom's guidelines and lessons are about process. And there's too little real exploration undertaken about U.S. objectives, and particularly how U.S. objectives might change over time under changing conditions of changing power relations, particularly in Asia. Presumably, U.S. objectives are to get China to avoid coercion and the use of force in managing disputes, and to become a more responsible stakeholder that upholds and strengthens global norms and the regional and global order. Tom talks about more Chinese support for R2P, for example, the responsibility to protect in UN assessments of activities in foreign countries, et cetera. But my question is, to what extent can and should the U.S. do more than verbally reassure and encourage China? On what can or should it accommodate China's needs, and especially its security needs, in ways that go beyond avoiding positions on sovereignty disputes, issuing regime change and policies toward other countries, not supporting Taiwan independence, supporting Chinese economic development, and its greater voice in the IMF or the World Bank? What can the United States, or should the United States do more specifically that's proactive, that can address Chinese security concerns? Tom talks about U.S. support for an economically and diplomatically strong China. But what about a more secure China, less susceptible to the potential threats presented by a dominant or offensively oriented U.S. force posture and military doctrine, particularly in Asia? To what extent should U.S. empathy for China's security needs, including the nationalist needs of the Chinese state, be addressed? The choice isn't between an aggressive China focused on solving or shaping external sovereignty disputes versus a cooperative China that's focused on domestic growth. A stronger China will attempt to do both. The challenge is to do both peacefully and in ways that don't strengthen the most vital U.S. interests. And what are those interests going forward? It's not just the pursuit of happiness. U.S. interests in Asia are really pretty specific in my view. And in many cases, they run up against Chinese interests. Now, on the historical side, and I'll try and speed up, I'm sorry. I'll try and condense this a lot. Let me just say on the historical side, I think Tom credits U.S. policy actions, pro and con, too much for their either beneficial or adverse changes in Chinese foreign policy behavior. And he sometimes, I don't think, adequately assesses the short-term versus the long-term impact of U.S. policy actions. Short-term could be beneficial. Long-term could be very unbeneficial. One example for me is the 95-96 actions the U.S. took during the Taiwan Strait crisis. Short-term could have been seen as salutary, yes. Long-term, I think it gave much more impetus to the Chinese to concentrate their military modernization efforts in a bigger way on dealing with U.S. intervention in Taiwan. Now, they would have done this anyway, to some degree. I don't think they would have done it to the same degree. I think they would have been more dispersed in their attention, and I think they would have had given greater credence to what they understood to be the original understanding with the United States that was struck during the time of normalization and the communiques. They saw the U.S. itself building up in support of Taiwan, and they were not going to have that happen again in terms of intervention to support. Even with the U.S. position on Chen Shui-bian in the early 2000s, which clearly showed it was not going to endorse Taiwanese independence per se, the process of U.S. support for Taiwan continued militarily pretty much unabated. So the last area, and there's another issue too that I would have with Tom about the impact of the 2009-2010 period, which I think he gives he credits more to the United States position than I think is warranted in understanding both the reasons why the Chinese became more assertive and the reasons why the Chinese became more moderate, relatively speaking, after 2010. But that's details that we could get into if you want. The final point, structural. Many, if not all, from my point of view, many, if not all, of Tom's guidelines for policy, U.S. policy, involve what I would regard as tactical adjustments to the existing panoply of U.S. China policies and their underlying assumptions. A more deft use of existing levels of strength and influence to move China toward a more responsible role in the world. But the ability to shape the choices of a sovereign and a rising power depends on your ability to decrease its incentives to employ its rising power to alter aspects of the status quo that you don't like. You can do this by deterring it, by reducing its desire to change the status quo, or by changing the status quo in ways that address its concern. In my view, China wants to change aspects of the status quo in Asia. And it wants to do them on these issues that Tom has talked about and that Dan has mentioned. The danger here is not all-out war as a policy option or policy choice. The danger, as Tom, I think, recognizes, is that Beijing could become more risk-acceptant in regard to some of these status quo issues as its power grows. But there's also the danger on the U.S. side that the U.S. could become more risk-averse or, more likely, in my view, overreactive to perceived real and imaginary Chinese security challenges, particularly as its relative power in Asia declines. And the assumption that I have in a lot of the analysis that I do about Asia is that in relative terms, U.S. power will decline, will continue to decline in Asia. I don't believe the United States is going to make the kinds of changes that Dan has suggested are necessary. I do believe that even at lower growth rates, that I've been doing projections on this, or I should say more specifically, my brilliant junior fellow who knows how to use statistics way better than I do, has been doing projections on this, and resource spending in Asia on defense for China and the United States over the next 20 years, 25 years does not look good. even at lower Chinese growth rates. The Chinese do not spend much money on their military now, under 2% of GDP. Even a much lower GDP for China, the Chinese can afford a lot of spending. Unless you assume the Chinese economy is going to crap out, which I do not, the situation doesn't look good long term. And so the question is, how do you best deal with that situation? So for me, it's assessing American options in a very changing power environment in Asia. And what does that mean? And for me, that involves understanding and thinking through accommodation, mutual accommodation, not American appeasement. But there has to be that kind of dynamic, I think, that needs to be pushed forward and discussed much more than it's been discussed so far in the United States government, and certainly in the Chinese government. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thanks so much.
I'm sorry I spent too much.
Not at all. Super helpful. I would say we don't have lots of huge sparks and lightning, but we do have areas of light rubbing here, which is the source of a potential conversation. There's, I think, some potential differences over the views about Chinese intentions, to some extent about trajectories of relative power and what the shadow of the future of extrapolating means. There's some differences potentially about how important China is to addressing problems, not just within the region, but globally, and the higher importance you put on Chinese collaboration, cooperation, the more important getting U.S. China relations right and cooperating is. I think there also might be some differences to some extent about not just the ability to shape China's choices, but the ability to the extent to which one can socialize China, not just to get Chinese to respond based on pressure and deterrence against what they originally wanted to do, but make them change their mind about what their interests are and how they see problems to begin with. So I think there could be discussions along all those things. I'm very mindful of the time, and at CSIS we really we emphasize an interactive conversation. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn over the questions to the floor. If you'd please, also in CSIS tradition, identify who you are and keep your question to a question and a single question. So we'll start right there. Yes, in the back, Stanley.
Thank you very much, Lauren Hershey, above average China watcher for about 50 years. Just comment briefly, you presented all these themes. On the stats I saw the other day on foreign students in the U.S. are about 1 million rounded, and of that, about 300,000 Chinese. What does it connote, and what should the Americans be doing in response, reciprocally?
Okay, thanks. I also wanted to maybe say 1 minute or two about the excellent comments. I really appreciate the comments. I mean, these are really busy, highly skilled people who spent a lot of time thinking about my book and giving really great comments, and I'm really grateful for it. And there were a couple of points that I didn't make in my talk because it was truncated, and they provided me the opportunity to make them now, and it won't take long. And one of the things that I think is really striking, and Michael raised this, he doesn't agree with this point, but I wanted to make it explicit, the point I make in the book, is that since 2008, China's been more difficult for the United States to deal with than it was before 2008. And that's because of the financial crisis. And what the financial crisis did for China is change two attitudes that affect the issues that I raised earlier. It made China feel more confident on the international stage, and it made the Chinese Communist Party more afraid at home. And that combination is a very bad combination for both the course of diplomacy pieces in East Asia and for the global governance pieces. Because when you come down to it, China's being asked by former colonial powers and the United States Cold War former enemy to be contributing to problems far away. And this kind of combination of domestic nationalism and international confidence, we don't need to be pushed around anymore, doesn't really help on that score at all. Where I think some of the solutions come. I do think China and the allies and its security partners, remember that's a whole set, have the ability to shape China's choices in constructive ways. And we've seen it before, and I try to outline those in the book, both in terms of regional stability and cross-strait relations, but also in terms of global governance like Sudan, Darfur, the Gulf of Aden operations, and anti-piracy. So I think there are some successes. We can't dictate, and we're not going to get everything we want, but we have no choice but to try. And one of the things is the strength of the U.S. alliance system. That's really what makes the United States stronger than China. I mean, China just doesn't have any real allies. It has Pakistan, and it has its only real formal ally is North Korea, and that's much more of an obligation than it is an enhancer of power. So the United States has a very robust alliance system, and as China moves out, if it does it in an abrasive fashion, that alliance system should strengthen, not weaken. So that should be if the United States responds in the ways that Dan suggested and pushes back in an effective way, we ought to be able to expand that if China missteps. And China ought to see that and adjust its own strategy from a rational perspective. So that's why I say. The 300,000 students, what does that show? It shows something really important. It shows that the Chinese Communist Party narrative about the United States containing China is a bunch of rubbish. Right? And I always ask, and I mention this in the book, that I ask my Chinese counterparts when they talk about U.S. containment strategy, I say, we tried to crush the Soviet Union, we tried to harm its economy, we tried to keep it from having any diplomatic successes or any prestige on the international stage. And I said, since the 1978 period, other than the Chinese people themselves, who has done more to help to assist China's rise than the United States? And you sometimes get acknowledgement, and sometimes you get red-faced frustration, but you never get a sophisticated intellectual answer to that question. So the idea that the United States is containing China is domestically driven propaganda. And there's no better evidence, sir, than the excellent example you raised. Why are we training all these Chinese and encouraging them to return by our visa policies? Right? Right? So it just doesn't make any sense. There's no intellectually coherent position that can say that the United States is containing China the way that we did with the Soviet Union. It's a different world, and we need to accept that. And we need to drive home to the Chinese that point, and a related point, which is the other Chinese Communist Party propaganda myth for domestic consumption, is that we want to destabilize China and see the regime collapse and China turn into turmoil so that it will be weak. And I can say the U.S. government is not well structured. That's why this challenge is bigger, not because the East Asia stability is not important. The U.S. government is extremely poorly structured to deal with a collapsing China. And we need to convey in our diplomacy, a collapsing China will be our worst nightmare. Please believe that. And when we suggest that you liberalize your system and you have freedom of expression and you have a media that can report corruption and you can have lawyers who can act in independent courts and not get arrested for defending people, it's because we want you to be stable. We wish China well. Because if China collapses, we are not ready. What would we do? There's no office in the NSC for China collapse, right? And it would have to be a really big office.
Super. All right, I think, given we have about 11 or 12 minutes left, I think a good idea would be to collect several questions. Let you respond first, but also let Dan and Michael as well. So we'll start here.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. I want to ask you, not just you, but the administration has been talking about emphasis on the alliance in Asia. I mean, China is really non-alliance country in that sense, but there is a scholar like Yan Xuetong talking about China actually do that. So actually, just like Mike talked about the result of Taiwan Strait crisis, U.S. aircraft is China end up building more anti-ship missiles. I mean, the last visit to China and South China Sea, the same signal the U.S. sending to the hawks in China in building military. So why don't you think the U.S. emphasis on alliance is not sending the same dangerous signal? Thank you.
Okay. All right, so just hold right there. We'll go right next to you, and then we'll come over here to Bert.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Byers with the Cipher Brief. So I really liked what you had to say about how all of the disputants really feel that they do have that claim over the South China Sea. And on that, I'm kind of wondering your thoughts on the U.S.'s decision to sail within the 12 nautical miles. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as a destabilizing force, or do you see it well, I guess in the same manner, do you see it maybe as an abuse of the freedom of navigation or a provocation towards China?
We're going to come right here to the front, the gentleman with the lovely tie.
It's Bert Keidel.
Thank you, Howard Keidel with the Atlantic Council. Tom, you mentioned the major challenge is global governance, but your whole posture seemed to be how can we get the Chinese on board with our concept of global governance? And that record is mixed. I mean, the developing countries coming out of poverty, China, East Asia are the best examples, and they broke all of the IMF rules and the World Bank rules. So, and the Chinese have the infrastructure bank that they've started. The Middle East is sort of U.S. global governance and Anglo and Franco from before World War I. It's not going well. Now, China was part of this work with Iran. So two heads are better than one in most problem-solving activities. To what degree might we want to be able to shift our model of global governance away from what you might call the pressures of our own domestic special interests towards what really works for the needs of the globe?
Okay, we're going to do one more question. Oh, wow. There.
It's going to be tough.
Harry.
Can I handle 4 questions?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Harry Harding. I divide my time now between the University of Virginia and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. My dilemma is which of your books I'm going to ask my Chinese graduate students to read, to buy and read in the winter. But my question is this, Tom. Both in your book, your excellent book, and today, when you talk about the challenge of governance, whether it is global or regional, this relates to Bert's question a little bit different. You kind of have there the two possibilities. Is China going to be the so-called responsible stakeholder, or is China going to be what you call napping, a free rider, or what Bob Sutter calls a cheap rider, not doing enough, maybe doing something, doing the minimum? What you don't talk about is the possibility that China will continue to do what I think it is doing, and that is not only to demand a greater leadership role within existing institutions of global governance, but also gradually to create new institutions, many of which Bert just mentioned. And I'm wondering, do you see that as an unimportant trend related to global and regional governance? Why don't you mention it?
Terrific. Why don't we take a breath here
Okay, yeah.
and let you respond to 4 very good questions, and then we'll see if we've got time to go back again out.
Yeah, I wanted to start with Bert's. Global governance, yes, we need to listen more. That's not a great national characteristic of the U.S. government, to listen to others, but we did do a lot of it. We had this regional sub-dialogue with the Chinese about regions around the world that came out of Robert Zoellick's initiative that started the responsible stakeholder. And we learned a lot about places that we knew nothing about. One of the things I was struck by when I was in the government, how little we knew about Libya in last decade. And how much the Chinese actually knew about it because they had been engaged. And we learned a lot in discussing Libya with them. But in terms of the norms, I think that, yes, I put a big emphasis in the book on this issue of regime change as an opening strategy. That is not necessarily required for responsibility to protect. You have to hold the regime accountable for what's happening within its borders, but you don't have to open the negotiation with Assad has to go, right? Now, if you do that, Assad's going to be in a better position because you're going to alienate powerful actors who can assist Assad and are more likely to assist Assad. And on the Libya issue, when I saw in early 2011 that Gaddafi's regime was referred to the ICC in a unanimous vote in the UN Security Council, I dropped my coffee because I knew China had voted yes. I never expected that. That was the kind of peak of this process from 2006 to 2011 that we got China to soften its traditional allergy to intervention. But what happened a couple months later, we got a mandate to protect the people of Benghazi. We expanded that mandate to become the Air Force for Gaddafi's eventual opposition. I don't miss the man. He was a terrible guy. But it destroyed the ability to get China on board for Syria. That and the combination of saying Assad has to go at the very beginning. So, yeah, I think we have to be careful how we pursue this. But we have common interests in new norms, responsibility to protect, that weren't there before. And in many sense, the U.S. and the Europeans are the revisionists. China's conservative, right? We're trying to change the rules because we think we have to after 9/11 to change the rules because we have to care what happens within countries, right? And I think we're right. But then how do you prosecute that? You got to listen in that process. And the new institutions, I think that we should be welcoming China's creation of regional infrastructure banks. That's a good use, that's a constructive use, that's a responsible use of these resources. And the way to approach it is to say, good, you're going to invest in infrastructure, here's how it could be better. That's how we ought to treat China in Africa. That's how we ought to treat China in Latin America. You're doing good things. You're investing, trading, that's great. But we have some experience there, and here's how you could make it even more constructive. Rather than saying, oh, if you're doing it without us, we're excluded and it's negative. I don't see any problem with that. I don't see anything really fundamentally new in Asia Infrastructure Bank. I don't see anything fundamentally new in China's free trade proposals. It seems like China is prosecuting old-style development assistance, old-style free trade agreements, and we're trying to create a higher standard in the TPP, right? We're trying to create more things, more investment-related things, IPR-related things. So it seems to me that eventually maybe China would get on board with those. So it's not a zero-sum struggle. The best outcome would be China would join those higher standard agreements, open up its economy more, benefit itself, benefit everyone else. So I don't really see it as a zero-sum prospect. And then for the alliances, the U.S. alliance system could be used in ways that would create unnecessary reactions, negative reactions in China, or it could be used in a way that would dissuade people in China from thinking that the way to solve all these many historical disputes that I laid out is to use coercion and force. And there are plenty of voices, as you suggested, in China that have that view. And the American alliance system is one of the best ways to say, this isn't worth it. Don't go down that route. This isn't the way to do it. And can China form its own alliances and a kind of counter? Good luck. I would say that the biggest problem with China forming a lot of alliances as a counter to the American alliance system is the Chinese form of government. People don't trust China enough to become hard and fast allies with China because of the form of governance, because the Chinese government on a regular basis expresses a distrust of its own people. And that's a big problem. The media, the academics, et cetera, et cetera. And it is a modernizing world. Democracy is spreading. It doesn't spread overnight. It's not done very well with the military, but it is spreading. And more countries take that kind of thing seriously when they consider their security partners. What kind of regime am I dealing with? So China is, on principle, a non-aligned state, but it's also a non-aligned state, and it will probably continue to be a non-aligned state in a major way, in fact, because of the nature of the government. And the types of allies it will be able to get may not add greatly to China's power. China's closest friends around the world are basically a rogues gallery of countries. And that could change if China reforms, which would be good for everyone. If China got a bunch of allies after it reformed its system and became more attractive to people, that would be good for us. Because the big win would be China would have reformed itself in a positive way and become more trustworthy not only to its new allies, but also to the United States. And that would be a win-win. So I guess my big answer to all these questions is this is not a zero-sum game. It's a very competitive, it's a very dangerous set of circumstances, as Michael laid out and as Dan laid out from different lenses. But it's not, at the end of the day, a zero-sum game where what's good for China is bad for the United States and what's bad for China is good for the United States. I just don't see it that way.
All right. We're running up close to the end of the time, but I'm willing to go over for a little bit longer.
I'll
if
stay.
You guys are,
I'll
right.
stay, yeah.
So the building is open until midnight at least. So I think we're fine here.
Yeah.
So we've got blankets if we need to.
Yeah. I come every Thursday.
Yes, good. So we'll take a couple more questions, and then what we'll do is we'll start on this side and let you guys comment. Some concluding thoughts if you'd like, and then let Tom have the final answer. So I want to go here, yes, because reporters can come up anytime.
If you could envision...
Identify yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. Robert Griffiths, National Defense University, and State Department of State as well.
Yeah.
If you could envision a strategy that would involve accommodating China, power-sharing discussions, stuff like that, do you see there's any possibility that the United States domestic political situation would allow for such an initiative to be taken?
Yeah. You know, with Michael, one of my differences, and Michael and I, we know each other's differences very clearly. So, you know, I could have given his talk, and he could have given. No, I couldn't give his talk. His talk was excellent. The last part of his talk, I could have given for him, and he could have given parts of my talk for me. I think one of the big differences we have is, for me, a balance of power, if it occurs, is an outcome that is not an intentional, negotiated outcome in a region. The U.S. tries to build allies and build its military. China responds with certain systems, and you end up with some sort of new distribution of capabilities. But it's not something you get through a sort of grand bargain. And I think the process of trying to get a grand bargain would be incredibly destructive, in part for the reasons you cite, in part because of Chinese domestic politics, and in part because, let's face it, I mean, we have to be humble. We're not smart enough to figure out. To do a grand bargain, you'd have to be able to project your brain 4 decades into the future about what the distribution would look like, and then start to walk it back to the present, and then make adjustments on that basis. And I just don't think we're smart enough to do that. So the effort to make grand bargains, and I don't like this flowery rhetoric about new type great power relations for the same reason, because it creates false expectations, it will create frustrations, and it will create unnecessary friction, in my opinion. So we just do it. No pivots. No new type great power relation, just strengthen the U.S. position in the region and the alliance relationships, find new security partners, find new ways to operate in an area where forward deployed U.S. forces are at greater risk, recognize the escalatory dangers of some of the strategies that are created in the face of that challenge. There are versions of air-sea battle that were floated around this town in public that I thought were not only dangerous if implemented, but also dangerous because if the U.S. focused on those strategies, what would happen is someone would go into the Oval Office in 10 years and the president would throw them out. So you don't want to come up with military strategies that no president would ever want to execute because it leaves fewer realistic options for the president in the future. So those are the types of things I look at. But it's, just do it. It's hard work. It has worked out more than it has not worked out in the past. There's no reason to believe that can't continue. And I just worry that trying to create a grand bargain, a total solution of the competition into the future is just going to cause a lot more trouble than it's worth. It's good to see you again. Thanks for your service. Are you retired from the Foreign Service now? Oh, okay.
Okay, terrific. Okay, we have the final question right here.
Thank you.
Tom Hillary, also Department of State, Office of India Affairs. So we've talked a lot about China and the U.S. butting up against each other as China looks east. What about looking to China's west and India's role in global governance and global security? How do you see that evolving?
Well, this gets to Bert's question too. Do we need to listen more? We need to listen more because it's not just China on climate change that pushes back when we make big demands. It's India. So it's not always a function of democracy or not democracy. In many ways, India is a tougher nut to crack on these climate change issues. And they come at it from the same view of a developing country. We're developing now. We have to burn fossil fuels to develop. We have a lot of coal. India has a lot of coal. China has a lot of coal. And it's a cheap form of energy. So we got to listen to that, and then we have to try to figure out ways to tackle green energy solutions. And those aren't easy, and what makes it more difficult in China, and this is just this isn't creating new Chinese norms. I don't think it's an alternative normative structure. I think it's just cheating on the existing norms. The IPR violations in China are a huge problem on these types of scores because the newest technology that will come to fruit in the next 2 or 3 decades, the best place to bring them would be India and China. And neither country has a very good record of IPR protection, and China is really bad. So that doesn't mean that China doesn't believe in IPR as a normative standard. It just means they don't resist the temptation to steal IPR from others. And that means that maybe the best technologies might not get there in a timely fashion to do the most good. So it's a big problem. And and on Iran and on Burma, back when I was in the government, India was a bit of a headache, more than a bit of a headache, because they had a different take on their relations with Iran and Burma than we did. But you have to listen to them, and I would hope over time we'd have a stronger partnership with India. And I don't think it has to be aimed at China, but if China chooses to become coercive and belligerent, let's say in the Indian Ocean in 15 years, it'd be very handy to have India as a partner. And my guess is if the U.S. leaves itself open to alliances and partnerships, that if China chooses the wrong road, we'll have that option as a counter. And that's a very good position to be in. So maybe I'm accused of being optimistic sometimes. I think it's a personality flaw. But on that score, I think the U.S. has a lot of strengths that people ignore, that we're an attractive country to other countries that are in trouble. And if China's going to become a bully, a lot of countries will be in trouble and looking for help. And I don't think the reverse is the case. I don't think China is a very attractive country for countries in trouble.
Yes.
You want us to wrap?
Yeah, okay. Mike, do you want to make some final? Thanks very much. Michael, do you want to make some final points?
Well, we're certainly not going to resolve this question here.
If we did, it would be a miracle.
It would be a miracle. But, I mean, just points of clarification. I don't advocate a grand bargain in the sense that the U.S. and China need to sit down at a table and say, okay, let's carve up Asia. You get this, we get this, we do this, you do this. That won't work for a whole host of reasons. But it doesn't preclude the possibility that countries need to make serious assessments about their long-term policies and how suitable they are for ensuring their most vital interests in a changing environment of power, and whether or not there are certain things that you can do with the expectation of reciprocity over time that would lead to the eventual reassurance by both sides that this changing dynamic will not result in instability. Now I totally agree that this is not easy. I mean, this is a very tough thing to do, but I think it requires some very deft leadership, understanding strategically about where the region is going and what the relative costs and benefits are of certain types of policies and assumptions, and then trying to institute certain things that could get you to a more stable environment over time. And I'm not terribly reassured by the notion that the allies will fill in the gap, because basically you're talking about Japan. The Philippines ain't going to do this. The South Koreans, in my view, are unlikely in the sense of acquire capabilities and operating procedures and doctrine that's designed to deal with China. They are more likely to hedge in a worsening situation, unless they're directly threatened, than they are to up their defense spending in ways that are designed to counteract the Chinese. The Japanese are a different story, and that's a long story, but I also don't see the Japanese as really filling in this gap. So now, and don't get me wrong, I'm not making an argument here that China is about to take over the region and we got to stop them. That's not my argument. I mean, I do not believe that I totally agree with the idea the Chinese don't want to dominate Asia as a deliberate strategy. And I don't think they're capable of doing it. But I don't think the United States is capable of doing it either. And the United States has been essentially the dominant power in the maritime area of Asia for 70 years. That will no longer exist, in my view. So you have to say, what does that mean for our current policies in dealing with each other? And I think it requires more change. I don't think Tom fully recognizes what I just said about the power shift. And B,
it's a cognitive bias, I think.
that it's a kind of thing where it's going to be very difficult to be able to adjust to it adequately, and I do think we agree to that. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you very much, and very rich discussion. I'd say a couple things. I mean, it matters a great deal whether you think that in some ways it's strange for me to be talking about do we need policies that are more accommodating or co-managing or so on, when I look at the Chinese numbers and my strong belief in the compelling case that China's actually in a 10 to 15 year stagnation period, really a lost decade period. And it's true that China will still have military power, and it's true that China could spend a lot more on its military, but it'll have to divide it more between continental issues internal security issues and maritime issues. So it matters a lot what you actually think about the next 15 years in China, and I see China, the numbers are just not good. The other thing that matters a lot is whether you think the United States will actually, in some real way, decide to play the role that it has in the past 70 years. And so those are, I think, two big questions, and that's really the starting point in terms of questions of how much accommodation and how much balancing and so on. I think we also have to take a step back and say China is not Asia. Russia is not Europe.
Right.
Iran is not the Middle East, and China is not Asia. So we have an enormous amount of countries, a couple of which we just entered into a decent, not great, but decent trade agreement with, the TPP, Vietnam and Malaysia, which now have enormous potential to take off as economies, enormous. And particularly if I'm right, or not if I'm right, but if my reading is right, about China's relative stagnation and these countries' great potential, Vietnam, Malaysia in particular, maybe others that join in. If India ever gets its financial and economic act together, and that too, then we have to take a step back and say, what's our strategy? Well, our strategy, and this goes back to Tom's point about it's nothing personal to China, it was our strategy when Theodore Roosevelt looked at the Japanese winning the Japanese-Russian War, is to not have any one hostile power dominate the region. That explains the continuity that Tom described from the end of the Cold War to now in terms of how presidents have thought about it, and I think it describes things going forward. So if that's our strategy, it doesn't matter if it's China, it doesn't matter if India turns hostile, we're going to want to create a set of alliances, maybe new alliance structures, and Tom's absolutely right, that is our abiding strength. We're going to want to invest more in our defense, and we're going to want to have an abiding strategy in Asia that creates a balance of power favorable to us and is in our interest in many other ways. And China just becomes a piece of that puzzle, one great power in the piece of that puzzle. And I guess I would end by saying that it could end well. Tom's analysis, if I'm right about it, of 1995, 1996, which by the way, there are certain things, in domestic politics that no president could have acted any differently in 1995, 1996 than Bill Clinton did. It would have been impossible for all kinds of reasons. And we just have to know that about ourselves in the United States. And I would also say that we have to know this about ourselves too, that we historically, now we can all sit up here and say that calling for regime change is not a great idea. But historically, the United States, even when it didn't mean to, in Libya and in other places, has created regime change. And that's just part of our DNA. We don't stop, And China knows this
Eventually
very well.
it's going to be selected out, I hope.
Yeah, it never will be. We are both an empire of liberty and we are pragmatic power. Yeah, we can't help ourselves.
We're going to overthrow you. We can't help it.
Well, that's true, and that's been the history. That's been the history, and that's empirical fact. Talk to the Koreans, talk to the Japanese, talk to the Germans, talk to the Italians, talk to the Taiwanese, talk to the Eastern Europeans, talk to the Soviets, talk to the Libyans. It's our history, and we might not like it.
Encouraging political change is different than saying this regime has to go tomorrow.
I agree with that.
That's a different.
I agree with that. What I'm saying is,
I support encouraging political change.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. What I'm saying is, China will always fear us because they know this about us. Yes. Even if we wanted to, we would never leave them alone. But finally, I would say that the best scenario is according to Tom, is a China that is reforming, as it was in the 1990s, market reforming. It's not. Reform has stopped. It feels confident about its reform. It's not. A U.S. that is not provocative in its statements but strong in its alliances. It's not. It's strong in its alliances, but it's provocative in its statements. And so, in terms of the actual U.S.-China relationship, piece of the larger Asia strategy puzzle, I would go back to Tom's point and basically say that absolutely no more pivots, no more rebalancing, no more calling for regime change, building alliances, building power. But then the China piece of it is how do we press for more market reform? and less stagnation, because that, I think, is tending China into a more unstable path.
Terrific.
I missed one person's question. The answer is yes. I do support the last one, just for the record.
This is just starting to get exciting, and since we've got another 12 hours before the building closes, let me just wind this up by saying, a lot of times there's a caricature of China specialists that are divide them between panda huggers and dragon slayers, with one. And we know that that's not true. You give the media any complex story, they'll put it into something that's very simple. And also, what's not true is that people talk past each other. It's very clear that we are asking, all of you are asking very similar questions, and coming up with complex answers, sometimes different answers, sometimes similar, but complex ones. And so I think it's a very productive conversation that we're having, not just today, but it also reassures me that even though we may not get China policy perfect in the U.S., we're working our way there. It's not going to be that far from what we could do. And Tom, your book and your contributions over the years helped a lot for that conversation and dialogue, and the comments from both of you, Michael and Dan, as well. So everyone, please join me in thanking both Tom and Dan and Michael.